Hi, and welcome to another short lecture from your textbook. So, today I want to talk to you a little bit about expressing emotions. So, the first thing that your book tells us about expressing emotions is that research confirms the value of expressing emotions appropriately. We know that people who are inexpressive emotionally, people who don't talk about how they feel, are more likely to manifest a whole bunch of physical problems, not just emotional problems, but physical problems as well. They're more likely to get cancer, more likely to suffer from asthma, more prone to heart disease, right? We also know that it's not just about expressing emotion, right? Like it's not just about telling everyone how you feel. It's a question of doing it appropriately. So we know, for example, that communicators who overexpress negative feelings, people who are constantly expressing that they feel bad, suffer physiologically. So these folks, like the folks who don't express emotion at all, have physical problems. We know that their blood pressure goes up, for example. So the key to all this then is expressing your emotions constructively. And so in this short lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about how that works. Now, the first step in constructively expressing your emotions really has to do with recognizing your feelings. And so as a result, in order to do so, you kind of have to ask yourself, how do I feel? And in some sense, this seems like an easy question to answer, but I suggest to you it's really not. Oftentimes, our emotions are all sort of tangled up. We might be experiencing more than one emotion at one time. The causes for our emotions might be harder for us to identify than we realize. At times, we might not want to identify how we're feeling. We might not want to acknowledge these things because, as we talked about already, people have some reservations about talking about or even considering their feelings. So as a result, what we find is that this question of how do you feel is easier for people to answer if they're effectively oriented. Uh, People who are emotionally aware, in other words, have an easier time answering some of these feelings, and have an easier time identifying their emotions. Right? I mean, this is all part of emotional intelligence, all part of EQ, and of course, we know that women are generally better at this than men. So the next thing we have to realize in terms of expressing our emotions constructively is that there's a difference between feeling and acting. So just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean you have to talk about it, and talking about a feeling doesn't mean that you have to act on it. Um, we go through all kinds of feelings, obviously, in the course of a day, and we don't act on all of them. We don't talk about all of them. And again, just because we talk about some of our emotions doesn't mean that we have to act on them. So, evidence, of course, as we've already talked about, suggests that people who feel angry and lash out because of it feel worse than people who feel angry and don't act on it. So, this is an important thing to remember as you consider how to communicate how you feel to others. So, part of the guidelines, of course, is having an emotional vocabulary to begin with. Most of us don't have the capacity to really express ourselves when it comes to, or at least express ourselves properly when it comes to talking about our emotions. Um, we have certain tendencies because of this, right? Like we use single words. I feel angry, right? Angry can mean all different kinds of things, and to just say I feel angry doesn't necessarily really capture how you're feeling, right? I mean, you might feel angry and sad at the same time, or angry and disappointed, or angry and humiliated. But nonetheless, we tend to talk about things that way, right? We don't expand on them. We're very short, brief when it comes to discussing emotions. Oftentimes, we don't even talk about our emotions, and instead we do things like we describe what's happening to us. So we'll say something like, "My stomach is in knots," or like I just don't feel good, right? I mean, these are all ways of avoiding talking about the actual emotion itself. At other times, we do things like we talk about what we'd like to do instead of how we feel. I'd like to give you a hug instead of telling someone, I feel really close to you right now, or, I love you, right? So these are all ways, of course, that we send coded and non-specific messages. These are all ways of talking about our emotions, of conveying these emotions. But there are ways of doing it that are coded. Um, and I submit to you, this isn't always the best way to go about expressing ourselves. Oftentimes, if we just talk about how we feel, particularly if we do it again in this constructive manner, if we do it in a positive way, it can be really, really helpful. And of course, to do that, we need to develop a sufficient emotional vocabulary. So part of this developing this vocabulary is realizing that oftentimes we have multiple feelings. Mixed emotions are common. Yet when we talk about our feelings, we tend to express the negative ones, right? So the example I give for this, of course, is when a child gets lost in the store. Now, many of you, for those of you who are parents, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about, and the rest of you have probably been lost in the store at some point, right? So you'll understand the reaction. But when you lose your child in a department store, in a Home Depot or Walmart, right? You go through this whole series of emotions. So at first it's you're really scared and you're looking all over for your kid, and you get progressively more and more upset until you find them. At which point you feel a tremendous sense of relief, right? Like you're just so happy that you see your kid. But what the kid gets is not like, oh my God, I'm so happy to see you. The kid gets, oh my God, if you do that again, I'll kill you, right? So right there we have these tremendous, really powerful mixed emotions. But the one that we end up expressing at the end of the day is not, oh, I'm so happy that I found you, I love you so much. It's one of anger, right? Like if you do that again, I'll kill you. And so, part of communicating effectively is showing that full range of emotions. If you can do it again constructively, to let people understand that it's not just one emotion, that there's a complexity to what's going on, to the emotional calculus of the situation. And letting people understand that, and giving them insight into your emotional status can be helpful in terms of building relationships. So the other thing, of course, we need to consider when we're expressing emotion is when and where context, right? It's important to recognize, for example, that it's usually not best to speak out as soon as you feel an emotion. Right? You need to stop. You need to take stock of who you're talking to, where you're at, the timing, right? All these things. And so one way of doing that, of course, one way of making sure that you're saying the right thing in the right context is to imagine the interaction in advance of the actual conversation. This can really help your relationships by giving you time to rehearse what you're going to say. Now, we all do this, whether or not we realize it, right? I mean, we've all practiced maybe, what we're going to say to our parents to get them to let us go on spring break, what we're going to say to our boss to get a raise, right? We know intuitively that this is a useful way of putting together a plan, right? Just rehearsing it. And rehearsing it makes it so that you don't have to improvise it, right? So that maybe you're not overwhelmed with the strong feeling and say something that's not appropriate for the time and the place. Also, of course, we have to consider if the receiver, if the person you're talking to, is ready to hear the message that you have to send. Oftentimes, people, particularly when you're talking about them, right, when it's face threatening, when it's something that might threaten their perception of themselves, oftentimes we'll find that people aren't ready for these kinds of messages, and it's difficult to find a time that is appropriate for these kinds of messages. People who suffer from various forms of addiction, for example, are notoriously unable to understand or receive messages at certain times, right? Like you might tell someone, man, you really got to stop drinking or it's going to kill you. But they won't do it because they're simply not prepared to hear that message. They're not at a point where they can actually receive it and have it be meaningful. If anything, it might just make them angry at you. And then, of course, sometimes it's best not to communicate at all. This is something that goes against much of what you've probably been taught, right? Which is that enough communication will solve everything, and if you just work hard enough at trying to communicate, things will work out. But this isn't always true. Sometimes it's best just to keep quiet, right? Particularly, again, if the receiver, if the person you're talking to, isn't ready to hear what you have to say. And when this happens, sometimes writing down your emotions can be a good substitute. Sometimes just writing down how you feel when the other person isn't ready to hear it is an effective way of organizing your thoughts, of helping you realize what you are feeling. And it's effective because you don't have to worry about context, and you don't have to worry about whether or not the other person is ready to hear these things. So, if you do speak to someone else about your feelings, it's important to make sure that your language reflects the fact that you ultimately are responsible for how you feel. And this is hard for many people to come to grips with, right? Um, as I suggested earlier in another one of the mini lectures, how you feel is your responsibility. It's up to you to decide how you feel. You can't change what happens to you, but you can change the way that you feel about it. That's what reappraisal, the process of reappraisal, is all about. So ultimately, you're responsible for how you feel. So as a result, it's better to say something like, I'm getting angry, rather than you're making me angry. When you say something like, you are making me angry, you're putting the responsibility for your feelings on someone else. And at the end of the day, that's not fair. It's not accurate either. Someone might be doing something that irritates you, but it's your decision to be irritated, right? So when this happens, right, what you're doing is you're using what we call I language, which shows that you're taking responsibility for your own feelings. I language in these kinds of conversations is better than you language. You language is alienating. It makes people upset. It makes it seem like you're blaming them for things, which to some extent you are, right? But when you use I language, you indicate that you're taking responsibility for your feelings, and it's less threatening, right? And opens up the channels of communication. Speaking of channels, it's important to be mindful of the channels that we use. So when we talk about channels in communication, we're talking about what we use to communicate, right? And we all know that there are some channels that are more appropriate for some messages than are for others. So, for example, it's probably not okay to break up with someone by text if you've been dating for 3 years, right? That's something you want to do face to face. It's probably not good to text someone that their parents died, right? Or email them that their parents died. That's something that you'd want to discuss with them face to face, right? So the channels we use to communicate make a difference in how others interpret our messages. And this is really true when it comes to emotion and emotional issues. We have more channels available than ever before. We have email, we have texting, we have instant messaging, we have the phone call, we have the telegram, right? I mean, we have all these different ways to talk to each other, but not all of them are appropriate for all types of communication. What we find when we study this is that people have no problem sharing positive emotions in person. But when it comes to sharing negative emotions, generally we like mediated channels, meaning that we'd rather do it through some other means, right? If we have a really negative, emotionally charged message to deliver, a lot of times people want to do it by text, or they want to do it by email, or they want to do it by phone, rather than in face-to-face, because frankly, it's kind of threatening, right, to share these kinds of messages face to face, even though this might be the more socially appropriate way to do it in the context. And then of course we have flame wars, right, which sort of indicate that we're more comfortable sharing negative emotions through mediated channels, through online communication, through asynchronous communication, right? I mean, again, because of disinhibition, we're much more likely to be aggressive in mediated situations than we are face to face. So we're more willing to get involved in flame wars and cuss people out and this sort of thing than we are in person. All right, that's it for today. Next time we'll talk about managing emotions. Thanks for joining in.